Start now.
So, hello everyone. I'm the only one that didn't quite do an introduction. I'm Cindy. I am part of the SAPEX and UpAven team as business development sales support. I'm Tanya's right hand. And Ken doesn't need an introduction, okay? I mean, he has made himself famous. Thanks, Ken. But I'm glad you are here to join us. Thank you for your time. Ken is owner of Kent Outsourcing and a DDMRP Fundi. And without further ado, I shall now hand over. Thank you, Ken.
All right. Sorry about that, chaps, ladies. But let's get going. Yeah, that's me. I'm not going to spend time going through all that lot there. So you can see that. We'll get you a copy of the slides so that you can have a look. You've got a complete copy of the slides. But before I start, I just want to position where we're going to be talking about this afternoon, because DDMRP is about the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model, which is a complete model for your operations. And it starts off with the adaptive S&OP process, which is the strategic process in the business, which provides a business plans and parameters down to the tactical part of the enterprise model, which is demand-driven S&OP, which then provides model configurations and master settings down to your demand-driven operating model. But it doesn't stop there. We actually get a feedback. Now, this is something that we haven't had available to us in past models that we've been using to plan and control our businesses. But we get this variance analysis coming back from our demand-driven operating model to this tactical portion, the demand-driven S&OP. So we get this continual, let me put my, if I can get my pointer options on here. Okay, so we get this continual variance analysis coming back, and we look at what's happening with our operating model, and we make changes and we make it better, etc. But we also, in our tactical demand-driven S&OP, we project the model into the future, and we look at model projections, innovation, and strategic recommendations coming back to strategy here. Now, on the left-hand side here, our operating model is being driven by actual demand, actual sales order, or actual requirements coming out of the buffer. And over on the right-hand side here, we're being driven by market-driven innovation. So what we're going to be talking about today is this demand-driven operating model. So we need to implement a flow-based operating model in our business. And we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We've got some really great stuff that's happened over the last 50 odd years. We've got MRP, DRP, Lean, theory of constraints, factory physics, Six Sigma, all great stuff on their own. But by taking the best out of these, we can combine them with some innovation and come up with a new operating model that we can use in our operations. And this operating model, first of all, is going to be paced to actual demand, not to a forecast, which we know is inaccurate. It's going to be paced to actual requirements coming from the customer. We're going to strategically decouple points in the supply chain for lead time compression and to mitigate that bullwhip effect. Thirdly, we're going to strategically place control points in our operating model to schedule synchronization. These control points would be where material enters the operating model, where it leaves the operating model, where materials come together or where they come apart within the operating model. These are the sort of places where you would put control points. And then at these control points, we want to protect by decoupling the control points by using either inventory buffers and time and capacity buffers. So if we look at a flow-based operating model, we start off with demand-driven MRP, and this is the buffers. And this is where we start all DDMRP implementations by putting in inventory buffers. Okay, now these buffers are being driven, and if you've been on previous webinars, then you'll understand that these are being driven by actual demand coming from the marketplace. And this is the supply order generation. So using the net flow calculation, we calculate when we need to replenish the stock in the buffers. Now, stock can be replenished in a number of different ways. We can have manufacturing orders, we can have purchase orders, and we can have stock transfer orders, okay? If this is a manufactured part, a manufacturing order will be sent down to the demand-driven scheduling, finite control scheduling facility down here. If it's a purchase order, it'll go straight down to demand-driven execution. We'll place those purchase orders. And if it's a stock transfer order going out to a distribution center, for example, that would also go down to the demand-driven execution portion of the operating model. But we get feedback. So those manufacturing orders that are coming down to the finite scheduling will get promise dates coming back from there. We request a date, but the promise could be slightly different. And the same thing happens with the purchase orders and stock transfer orders we send down to the demand-driven execution section of the demand-driven operating model. And we get these on-hand and synchronization alerts coming back. But we also get these released manufacturing orders going down to demand-driven execution portion of the operating model as well. And we'll be getting progression of those manufacturing orders coming back to the scheduling system. But it doesn't stop there, because we have this tactical demand-driven S&OP portion in our adaptive enterprise, which is providing the model configurations to drive the demand-driven MRP and the demand-driven scheduling. Demand-driven MRP, we're getting information about the stock buffers and bills of materials. Model configurations for the demand-driven scheduling are the sort of things we get out of our routings and sources information coming from the demand-driven sales and operations planning process. But it doesn't stop there, because we get this variance analysis coming back. So we're continually looking at how our operating model is working, and we're sending information back to the operating model to improve it. So we must, just want to try and move this thing out the way here. All right, assumption number one then. Let's have a look. We've got these 9 assumptions that we want to look at today. So assumption number one is assets must be closely synchronized to actual demand as possible. So the cost of being wrong has grown dramatically with the rise of complexity and volatility. We're now living in this VUCA world. And if we get it wrong, it can be very, very costly for us. We think the customer wants this, but he wants something totally different. We think he wants so many and he wants so many more. The cost of being wrong is becoming very costly for us. And we know that if we try and forecast into the future, forecasts are always going to be wrong. The more detailed they are, the more wrong they're going to be. And the further we have to look out, the more wrong they're going to be as well. So we have this of long planning horizons. We have to look out to a cumulative lead time to do our planning, which could be 50 days, and that's quite short. I find in many manufacturing plants, we could be looking at 4 to 6 months for a cumulative lead time, and trying to determine what it is we're going to be building in 4 to 6 months time, because today we need to order the raw materials down here, where our customer tolerance time is very short. May only be a day or two, or maybe a week or so, but it's very, very short. And we find that by doing this, the capability of our organization or our operating model and the actual demand are way apart from each other. And so what happens when we do this? Well, we get these guaranteed effects. We get too much inventory. We get shortages. So we got too much of the wrong stuff and not enough of the right stuff. We have these costly expedites and schedule break-ins. And then there's a bonus at the end of the day, because we get all these lots of spreadsheets, and everybody has a spreadsheet. Everybody's trying to work out what they should be doing today and tomorrow, what they should be buying, what they should be making, because the systems are just not working for them. And we blindly follow these spreadsheets, and hopefully they're correct, but in many cases they're not. There's often quite a few errors in these spreadsheets. So we need to be working on a more accurate demand signal, and this is where we're moving away from conventional master production scheduling and MRP planning, which uses a forecast out to that cumulative lead time, to move into something a little bit more, a little better. Only qualified sales orders within a short range horizon are used in our demand-driven operating model to determine order generation. So if we go back and have a look at the MPS and the MRP, it was not designed for long, uncertain planning horizons. MRP only produces a realistic schedule when it has three basic assumptions are valid. The demand is known and doesn't change. Well, we don't know what the demand is out to the cumulative lead time. We know for one thing's for sure, it's going to change. Number two, there is sufficient time to accomplish all of the required activities within the customer tolerance time. And if you go back to look at when MRP was introduced in 1960s and 70s and 75, if you look at the text that Orlicky wrote, the demand time fence should be set to your customer tolerance time. That's how it was designed. But we can't do that because our cumulative lead times now are so long and the customer tolerance times are so short that this is one of the reasons that our traditional MRP is not really working for us. And number three, there's no variability in execution. Everything must go right. Well, we know there is variability and things will go wrong. So this brings us to number two assumption. Variability cannot be eliminated, but its impact on system flow can be effectively controlled and mitigated. So fact, normal and random variation exists in every process. A process is still deemed to be in steady state as long as the variation is within calculated control limits. So we say a product is in steady state, but there is variation within that process between those control limits. So steady state does not mean without variation. Everything has variation. So probability of simultaneous availability. Anytime a step requires at least two inputs, it's subjected to the service level of both those inputs. And the more inputs, the worse the effect on the ability of that step to start on time and in quantity is a problem. Now this chart here comes out of Orlicky's book published in 1975. And he says here that if you've got a number of components that go into a subassembly or into a product, if you've got a service level of 90%, then we can see it's a multiplicative type of thing. So if you've got 25 components to go into that product and every single one of them has 90% system availability or material availability, it means that ultimately you're only going to have a 7% chance of putting that particular component or that subassembly together. Even with a 95% service level, you've only got a 26% chance of putting that together. And sometimes many subassemblies have many more components than that. I mean, just take a motor car that has 5,000 components in it. You're going to end up with a big problem there. So remember, MRP assumes full allocation in its plan. It assumes that everything is going to be there. And in many cases, you only need one item that's not there and it's a problem. So more complex environments are much more susceptible to this issue. And delays accumulate and gains do not. Many components can have very good availability, but it only takes one to have a serious implication on the parent part. So we only need one component with low availability, and we have a problem. The other thing is accumulations, delays accumulate. All right, so if we look here, we've got a bill of materials, we're manufacturing this product, FPA, and as we go through the process, we get delays, and these delays accumulate. And so the time it takes us to get this product out the door is extended. And the only way we can get this time down here is to apply, okay, by working overtime or getting more people or another machine or outsourcing or doing one of those things. So delays will always accumulate. Gains do not. So that brings us to assumption number 3. Constant and precise synchronized planning and scheduling across all materials and resources is pointless. Detailed MRP and shop floor schedules are always precisely wrong. There is no precisely right schedule, no matter how much money you spend on software or time, or you spend on your spreadsheets. Things are going to go wrong and you're going to have to reschedule again. So constantly rescheduling to attempt to account for this variation in execution actually introduces additional variability and subsequent confusion. So instead, variability must be absorbed at buffered positions. And we do this by putting in time or stock or capacity buffers to mitigate its effect on critical scheduled resources and customer commitment. So assumption number 4 then, some inventory is required at some stage in the supply chain. So what do we know? Inventory cannot be entirely eliminated. Okay, we need some inventory somewhere in the supply chain. At the same time, inventory shouldn't be everywhere. We need to strategically place it in the right places. Cumulative lead times exceed customer tolerance times in almost every industry. And long planning windows actually disconnect supply and demand. So, in conclusion then, the choice of where to place inventory is highly strategic since it determines the customer lead time and the level of working capital. The proper management of these inventory positions will largely determine the operational success of the supply chain. So we need to strategically decouple our supply chains. And if you come on the Demand-Driven Planner course, we go through 6 different positioning strategies. I'm not going to go through them in detail today, but we need to strategically place decoupling points of inventory within the product structure or the supply chain to stop this demand signal distortion going up the supply chain and the supply continuity variability coming down the supply chain. So by putting a strategic buffer somewhere in the supply chain, we will stop the transfer and amplification of variability in both directions, going up the demand signal distortion and coming down, stopping that supply continuity variability. But it does something else as well. It shortens the planning horizons and compresses the lead times, which is also another important factor. So when we have buffers in our supply chain, there are 6 tests for stock buffer success. We need to promote, protect flow in our supply chains. And the first test is, does it decouple? Does it decouple the supply chain? Does it stop that variation up and down the supply chain? The second one is a bidirectional benefit test. The buffer should provide a benefit on both sides of the buffer. On the demand side of the buffer, it provides availability. There should always be availability in the buffer. On the supply side, it provides the supplier with similar sized regular orders rather than being bullwhipped. Order independence test is the third one. That means that any material sitting in that buffer is there for anybody to legally take out of that buffer. It's not there for any specific order or for any specific person or whatever. It should be the primary planning mechanism. Well, we know that DDMRP buffer is the primary planning mechanism. It determines when we need to replenish the stock in that buffer. We also have the relative priority test. We know which buffers are in better condition than other ones. What color are they in, and what's the percentage of the buffers left? So we have a relative priority between one material and another material. And we also have the dynamic adjustment test. We want to know that that buffer is going to dynamically adjust when the marketplace changes in any way, so it keeps pace with the marketplace. So if we have a look at safety stock and reorder point systems, how do they cut it? Well, they don't really. If you've got a safety stock system, it doesn't decouple. It doesn't provide benefits. It must be order independent. Yes, it is. And that's about the only one really. Is it the primary planning mechanism? No, safety stock is not. It is a secondary ordering mechanism. And what tends to happen is that as soon as we get into safety stock, we then bullwhip our suppliers because we have to maintain that safety stock level, and we send an order up the supply immediate delivery. It clearly depicts the relative priority? No, we don't know when one level of safety stock in an item is any worse or better than any other level of safety stock in another item. So we really don't know relative priority. And they don't dynamically adjust, or rarely do they dynamically adjust. Some people have tried to adjust their safety stock levels based on their forecasting performance, but people rarely do that. So safety stock is more like putting a plaster onto the system. It's more like a fire extinguisher. What we want is a firewall. We want nasty stuff stop going backwards and forwards through the buffer, whereas safety stock doesn't do that. If we look at reorder point, does that fare any better? Well, slightly. It does decouple, and it is the primary planning mechanism, but as far as other aspects of buffers are concerned, there's a no there. So that doesn't really match up to our DDMRP buffer. Also in reorder point, there's no demand consideration, and offer incorporates a safety stock mechanism as well. So assumption number 5 then, inventory is an asset and should be treated and managed as such. Okay, the decision of where to place inventory is a strategic decision. It must be placed at points that promote and protect flow. And once the placement has occurred, careful management is required to make sure that the inventory position continues to be an asset to the flow. So here we can see we've got finished goods buffers sitting at a distribution centers here. We've got a factory warehouse here with a stock buffer. We've got stock buffers of raw materials, etc. But we've also determined that we should be buffering within our own bill of materials as well. And we've broken this down to a number of smaller planning horizons, which are a lot easier to maintain and plan. So there are 2 universal points of inventory. A, where we have nothing or too little and we got back orders, or B, where we got too much. And the distance between those 2 things is, and that dotted line is really the return on our investment. So if we have no inventory or we've got back orders, obviously there's no return on investment in that case. In fact, it's costing us money. Over on this side, we've really spent money on inventory and we're not getting a return on it. So we would like to see the majority of our SKUs sitting in this optimal range in the middle here. So inventory is an asset if it's in this area here, but it's a liability if the on-hand balance is sitting in these 2 areas over here. And what happens when we go and analyze warehouses, and I've done quite a few of these, is that we find If we look at the number of items or SKUs in a warehouse, we have a number of items down here where we have too little or we're out of stock. And we have another huge amount of items sitting over here where we really have too much. Typically, I find this hump here is a lot bigger than this one down here because buyers and planners tend to buy double to stay out of trouble. So we generally have a lot of items sitting in this area here, and very few items actually sitting in the optimal range. And if we're running MRP, we get this oscillation happening. We're either, with MRP, we're either okay or we're not okay. And then we're okay again, and then we're not okay. And it fluctuates backwards and forwards like this. So we end up with a lot of items over here, a lot of items down here, and very few sitting in this optimal range in the middle here. So with the buffer, we set the buffer up so that it covers this asset range here. So we have a green, yellow, and red zone in our buffer, and ideally we want to try and get all our items on average, our average inventory sitting in this kind of area here, which then everybody's happy. Yes, we have a few out here on the tails on each side here, but this is what we're doing in our demand-driven sales and operations planning. We're looking at these items and saying, why have we got too little here? Why have we got too much there? What can I do to bring these items into the middle here? So it's a continuous improvement process. And I think we just need to remember that MRP was never designed to manage stock. It was designed as a perfect make-to-order calculator. And that is why it always nets to zero. And because it netted to zero all the time and we were out of stocks, people started adding safety stock into MRP. MRP never originally had safety stock in it. People have added that in there because when things go wrong, they had no way of catching up. So number 6, some level of protective capacity must exist in any environment with multiple interacting resources. So trying to get that perfect balanced line is really a mythical creature. It's that unicorn we've got here with an enormous price tag for most companies. Resources in our organizations have disparate levels of capacity relative to their respective required tasks and volumes. And this disparity means that precautions must be taken against misusing or wasting points of additional capacity. Quite often we just want to keep the machines running because that's the way we're being measured. So we're using valuable raw materials to produce product that sits in the warehouse and in the worst case scenario gets thrown away after 5 years or past its sell-by date. So there are two different ways of looking at capacity. On the left-hand side here, we've got the flow-centric way of looking at capacity, all right? So when we're in the green, it's great. It's not so great, okay? Because there's a chance we're gonna run out of capacity here. We want to be able to keep the flow going by making sure that we have enough capacity. Whereas if we're in a cost-centric, in a traditional way we look at our capacity, if all the items, if all the resources are not sitting up here, up in the green here, we're not utilizing them to the maximum, then that's kind of bad because and then we end up, as I mentioned before, using this excess capacity here to build things that we don't need and put in the warehouse and ultimately throw them away. So capacity buffers protect, control, and decoupling points and offer opportunity for additional cash contributions, which is a tactical capability. So we can see down here, we have a tactical capability of producing more, but I don't want to produce so much more that I'm going to get into a situation where I could run out of capacity. Utilization metrics rooted firmly in erroneous cost assumptions lead to misuse of protective capacity. The boss always wants to see the machines running if we're working in a cost-centric operating model. I don't want to see those machines standing because it's costing me money. But it's going to cost you more money in the long run because you've made stuff that nobody wants. So capacity structure considerations, commitment to invest in flexible labor or sprint capacity to prevent floating bottlenecks. So we've got a production line here. We've got 5 different processes. I've got a drum here, a drum process here, a bottleneck possibly, or a constrained resource. And I've got some stock of raw materials. And I'm going through 3 processes here. And before this drum, I have a time buffer because I know variation is going to happen here. And what I want is capacity rising here so I can catch up if necessary. So we have a time buffer in here going into this drum so that when we've scheduled the next part to go onto the drum here, it is available sitting in the time buffer here. And we've done the same thing here going to the control point, which might be where we ship the product out to the customer. So as variability grows in dependent systems, capacity should be structured or aligned to deal with it. So ideally, we want to be in this kind of situation, as I mentioned just now, where we've got rising capacity availability as we go through the processes. If we have the opposite happening, where the capacity is falling here, we're going to run short of time. We're going to need a larger time buffer here. And at this end here, we're probably going to need a larger buffer of the finished products. So we want to try and get into this situation here if we can. It will reduce the time buffers, and it reduces the stock buffers that we need in the system. So this brings us to assumption number 7. Batching decisions should be based on flow instead of cost. Batching is reality in most industries. In the consumer products and fast-moving consumer goods, we make things in batches. It's what happens, and we can't really get away from that. But how do we determine what those batches are? Quite often we use economical order quantities, or somebody's come up with a minimum run size or a minimum order quantity. Maybe we have minimum freight policies that we need to fill up a container, or we maybe have minimum order cycles when I want to make it once a week or once a month. Somebody's come up with these figures as a kind of thumbsuck. What typically drives these batches? Well, not often I find it's flow, it's more about cost. So demand-driven batching rules, batch for flow, not for unit costs. Flow is tied to actual demand, whereas cost is not. When things flow well, cost is under control. The inverse is never true. Cost is a measure of performance over a past period. If that past period had good flow performance, then there's a favorable impact on the cost. Nothing is ever truly utilized without considering actual demand. So I can be producing factory right up to my total utilization, filling up warehouses, filling up supply chains. But unless somebody actually comes and buys it from the retail outlet, I haven't actually sold it. I've just filled up supply chains with materials. So quite often when we look at batching, here we've got 22 items here, and the factory's decided that when they make these items, they're going to make them with 10,000 is the minimum order. It's a batch of 10,000. But if you look at the demand for these products, it varies considerably. On the left-hand side here, we've got huge demand for these products, and we're producing fairly small batches. In fact, if you understand the DDMRP buffer, it means if you divide the green zone into the yellow zone, it tells you how many active orders you've got on the factory floor at that particular moment in time. But if you come down the bottom end here to this item number 22, it's got a massive green zone compared to the requirements. So batching for flow also means capacity is considered. We can't set batches so that we create capacity constraints due to setups. In a demand-driven operating model, each process batch is typically tied to the replenishment of a strategic buffer, and order minimums affect the zonal profile of a buffer. So these buffers are not, they don't look very balanced. The sizes in the zones are not very similar, and the same down here. So what we can do here is we can increase the minimum orders for these items that have got a greater demand, and reduce the buffers down here. Reduce the order batches down at that end there. So some batches can increase while others can decrease. This negates additional setups due to smaller batches on the smaller runs, and reduces the number of setups due to schedule break-ins. So quite often we have these large schedules and large setups, and we have to break into them because we run out of stock of another item. We have to break into that schedule, and then needs to be reset up again. So we find that this gives us lower total average tree as well, and better aligns capacity and space usage to the market consumption rates. And then batching for flow with prioritized share. All allocation schemas for grouping supply order generation across multiple items based on the net flow equation, and based on certain limitations or constraints to be managed. So for example, and this comes out of the demand-driven planner course, we might be sending a truck to a customer or going to refill a distribution center. We can look at the buffers at the destination and determine very easily what we need to put on the truck. So all these ones where the on-hand or the net flow, sorry, is sitting in the yellow zone, I can start filling the truck up. But then I've still got some space at the end here. So I'm going to look for those items where the net flow is at the bottom or close to the bottom of the green zone, and I'll put those on the truck as well so that I've got a full truckload. And we can do the same based on a spend value. If we're looking for free freight, for example, might be something that we're looking at. So we have this prioritized share, which brings us to assumption number 8. A key DDOM objective is to maximize periodic contribution margin in the tactical relevant range. What is periodic contribution margin? It's the total revenue minus variable costs and period operating expenses. And we look at the true variable costs here. So in operations, the metric objectives, the feedback we're getting from our operating model are these 3 things. Is our model reliable? In other words, does it execute to the model, plan, schedule, and market expectations? Is it stable? Are we passing on as little variability or variation as possible? And how fast does it work? Are we passing the right work on as fast as possible? But then that brings us down to the tactical measurements we're looking at. Here we're looking at really at processes here. And we can see this process is not really working very nicely. It's on the bit on the low side. And so we want to be looking at some tactical operations here, some metrics. So we've got tactical improvement and waste reduction. So identify and prioritize obstacles and or conflicts to flow. Tactical expense control. Spend minimization to meet the requirements of the market and the demand-driven operating model design. And then tactical contribution. Maximize system return according to relevant model factors and tactical opportunities in volume and rate. And we go into a lot of this in the demand-driven leader course if you manage to take that education. So we also need to, assumption number 9 is capability must be tied to the expected future of the company. And there are 6 different types of companies here. You might be interested to have a look at these and determine where you might be here. Are you stable and mature, where you've got existing portfolio that's just been going on for years, it doesn't grow, doesn't die, you've got a few line extensions? Or are you a clever innovator down here where your existing portfolio is going to be taken out within 2 years and new stuff's coming out here? This is the iPhone type of scenario, the Apple type scenario. Or are you sunset where you're just totally dying and going to phase out? So we need to understand the future of our company, capability of our company to be able to determine a few things here. We need to look at the 4 R's. We need to look at the rate. What are the expected future volumes? What resources are going to be required in the future? Return. How can the contribution margin relative to the required sources be maximized? And we should always be looking at the contribution, maximizing the contribution margin at the constrained resource or the bottleneck within our organization. And then there's that whole area of risks. What are the risks to the above? And how do we mitigate those? Now, this I really love because it explains a lot of why I think DDMRP really works. How can we reconcile the demand-driven operating model with sales and operations planning? So here we've got a time frame going out 12 months here. And if we look at a forecast going into the future, we know that a forecast is not a single number. It should be either have a plus or a minus, or it should be as high as this or as low as that. So we have the optimistic side of our forecast and we have the conservative side. But we need to take, what we normally do is we take that average number in the middle there. And we take that ADU or average daily usage, and we can see that that average daily usage is increasing, or we think it's going to be increasing over the next 12 months. So we take that projected ADU, we put it through the master settings in the demand-driven sales and operations planning process, and that creates a stock buffer. And with the ADU at this level at the beginning of this scenario, our buffers are fairly small, but as we think the ADU is going to increase, then we can see our buffer increasing into the future as well. So there's the projected average on hand. But what happens if we reach the optimistic side? Okay. Well, we've got this maximum upside limit here. We have this safety embedded in the buffer here. But what happens if the numbers go to the conservative side? Well, this is going to be our maximum inventory exposure sitting up here. And so what we can do is we can look at this capability range here and see how it matches the forecast range up here at any point in the future, going out into the future here. And if the capability range is too small to satisfy that forecast range, then we need to change the buffer status. We need to change the buffer profile. Or if it's too big, again, we could change the buffer profile to pull it more in line with the forecast range here. So the range of capability can then be compared with the range of forecasts to sense whether the capability range is sufficient. If demand is higher, the buffer will have safety. If the demand is lower, stock exposure is limited. If the range is insufficient, then adjustments can be made, considered for the model through the master settings. So to me, this is a really important aspect here, because in the past, what have we done? We've taken this figure, this ADU number, this single number, and we've put that into our master production schedule. And so we're assuming that that is going to happen in our master production schedule, and everything is calculated based on that master schedule and the MRP. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't really work for us today. But we can do the same thing with capacity. However, capacity doesn't change gradually. It tends to be a bit of a step change, doesn't it? So we can see here that our capacity, our load, is going to get very close to our overcapacity here. When we get to about period 6 or month 6 here. So we're going to have to put more capacity in, and we can see that growing again. So again, it's the same idea as the inventory, but we're just looking at when we need to change our capacity. So conventional scheduling and execution versus demand-driven operating model. Traditionally, we've early released our production orders. We tend to release them earlier. We've got a bit of time now, let's release them early. With DDMRP, there's no early release. We batch traditionally for resource efficiency because we're working on cost and utilization. But in DDMRP, we do batches based for flow. Release with shortages, traditionally, we think we'll catch up. The stuff will be coming in at some stage. We don't release with shortages in DDMRP or on the demand-driven operating model. Quite often in MLP, we have past due on release. We release things that are already past due. In the demand-driven operating model, no scheduling in the past at all. Critical resources have got fairly lumpy load where finitely scheduled critical points we have in the demand-driven operating model. Quite often we have floating bottlenecks traditionally, but we try not to have floating bottlenecks in a demand-driven operating model. We set up those control points or buffers or drums. Constant rescheduling and optimization with traditional planning, but we have very little rescheduling. I'm not saying you're not going to have any rescheduling because things do go wrong, but it would certainly be less than in a traditional system. Lots of expediting traditionally. We only expedite to buffer status here. So we're looking continually at the buffer status, and if the on-hand balance descends into the bottom half of the red zone, then yes, we'll get an expedite warning. Late deliveries, here we have few late deliveries because of the buffer status. There's always availability in the buffer, and people have improved their service levels tremendously by putting in a demand-driven operating model. High inventories, but here we've got right-sized inventories, and we've maintained low work in process levels. So as a review here, let's have a look at those 9 assumptions of a demand-driven model again. Assets must be closely synchronized to actual demand as possible. Kind of makes sense. Variability cannot be eliminated, but its impact on system flow can be effectively controlled and mitigated. Constant and precise synchronization, planning, and scheduling across all materials and resources is really quite pointless because something is going to be going wrong all the time. Some levels of inventory are required at some stage in the supply chain, and inventory must be treated as an asset and managed as such. Number 6 was some level of protective capacity must exist in any environment with multiple interacting resources. And batching should be based on and not on cost. A key DDOM objective is to maximize periodic contribution margin in the tactical relevant range. And lastly, we looked at capability must be tied to the expected future of the company. So if you want to know more, go and have a look at the Demand Driven Institute's website. If you haven't done so already, sign up and you'll get greater access to certain parts of the website. On demand here, you can go and look at the last Demand Driven World Conferences for the last two years or so, and the presentations and the case studies that are being presented there. There's more on the DDMRP methodology under this tab here. Under webinars here, there's a number of webinars that Carol and Chad have put together. You've got access to those. If you want to know more about the education side of the Demand Driven Institute, the Demand Driven Planner, Demand Driven Leader, etc., you'll find it there. And then you can understand the certification programs that the DDI have as well. There's a global calendar of events, resources, a lot of stuff under there, more case studies, videos, articles, books, etc. And then one of the things that the DDI does do is it looks at compliant software. If you think your software is compliant to the methodology, you can give a copy to the DDI. They'll look at it, they'll check the boxes and determine whether your software is compliant or not. These are the 3 books you should be looking at. So if you want to know more about DDMRP and the buffers, this is the one, but make sure you get version 3 as it's printed in color, or if you get the electronic copy, it's already in color. This book here is very interesting. It explains the stupid way we measure our businesses. So it's demand-driven performance using smart metrics. Really great book. And if you want to know more about the demand-driven adaptive enterprise, then this is the book to get. That's recently come out. There are some more books coming out, one on the demand-driven sales and operations planning process, and another one which Carol and Chad are getting involved in. So the Demand Driven Institute, you can access them on demanddriveninstitute.com. I've got a lot of videos on my YouTube channel, so you can go to YouTube and just look for me and you'll find a whole bunch of videos on Demand Driven in there. And if you want to know more about Demand Driven education, software, etc., you can go to Demand Driven Africa. And if you want to get hold of me, there's my telephone number and my email address. So, have I still got anybody with me? Hello, anybody there?
Yeah, we're still
Any
here.
questions? Oh, yeah. Good. What's the time? Oh, not too late.
No, you didn't go
yeah, have we got any questions, Tonya?
Colleen, did you want to ask a question?
No, nothing from me, thanks. Just didn't want Ken to think that we'd all left him.
No, it's terrible sitting here talking to yourself. You wonder if anybody's left. Oh, we've still got 12 people.
He's still got 12 people. Has anybody else got questions?
Was there anything in the chat here?
No, just people excusing themselves because they had to run to other meetings.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think everybody knows where to get hold of Ken. If you've got questions or you need some more information and you can't get hold of him, get hold of us and we'll connect you with him. And we're obviously running a series of demand-driven webinars and workshops, so watch out for those. And obviously, if you're interested in doing some training, we are planning on putting a demand-driven planner course on our calendar in the next coming weeks. We just need to finalize a date. So if anybody's interested in delving a little bit more and getting a bit more hands-on knowledge and experience, just let us know so we can put you down for any upcoming workshop. But other than that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience with our technical glitches. This is the first one yet since we started. But thank you for your patience, and for being here. And I hope to see you all at the next SafeX event, or at least the next demand-driven event. So take care, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Tonya.
Thank you,
everybody.
Ken.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much to all of you for all you're doing. We're really enjoying it.
Okay, keep well. Cheers.
Bye.